Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. It started as a joke. At least, that was how we treated it at first. It happened one afternoon after school when a few of my friends and I went into Aldi to buy snacks. We did that often back then. None of us had much money, so Aldi was one of the easiest places to buy drinks, crisps, sweets, and whatever else we could afford before heading home. It was a completely ordinary day. The shop was busy, but not crowded. People pushed trolleys through the aisles. Parents tried to control noisy children, and employees moved boxes around near the shelves. My friends and I were walking through the middle of the shop, arguing about what to buy, when one of them suddenly stopped. He grabbed my arm. "Look over there." At first, I thought he had seen someone we knew from school. Then I noticed the man. He was standing near one of the refrigerated sections, looking at something on a shelf. There was nothing unusual about his clothes. He wore dark trousers and a long black coat. It was a little strange because the weather was not particularly cold, but that was not what made everyone stare. He was wearing a full plague doctor mask. It was completely black, with a long beak extending from the front. Dark, round-eye lenses covered his eyes, and leather straps appeared to hold it tightly against his head. It did not look like a cheap plastic costume mask. It looked heavy, real, the kind of thing someone might wear in a historical film or at a horror event. But this was the middle of the afternoon in Aldi. There was no festival happening nearby. It was not Halloween. As far as I knew, there was no costume party or special event in the area. The man was simply doing his shopping. My friend started laughing. "What is this guy doing?" We all turned to look, trying not to make it obvious. Of course, we failed. A group of teenagers is not good at being quiet or subtle, especially when something strange happens. One of my friends whispered that perhaps the man had come directly from a costume party. Another said he might be filming a prank video. Someone else joked that he had traveled from the year 1665 to buy milk. We laughed quietly among ourselves. The man did not react. He picked up an item, examined it for several seconds, and placed it inside his basket. Then he walked to another section. His movements were slow and calm. He did not behave like someone trying to attract attention. That was one of the things that made it strange. If he had been filming a prank, he would probably have looked around to see who was watching. He might have spoken in a strange voice, moved dramatically, or tried to frighten someone. He did none of those things. He never spoke. He never approached anyone. He never acted aggressively. He simply walked through the shop like wearing a plague doctor mask was completely normal. Everyone noticed him. Adults glanced at him and then quickly looked away. A small child pointed, but the child's mother pulled his hand down and hurried him toward another aisle. Even the staff seemed uncomfortable. One employee watched the man from behind the till, but nobody asked him to remove the mask or leave. My friends and I kept seeing him as we moved around the shop. Every time he appeared at the end of an aisle, we started laughing again. At that point, we were not afraid. He was only a strange man in a strange mask. We paid for our food and left. Outside, we stood near the entrance for a few minutes, opening drinks and talking about what we had seen. One friend said we should wait and ask him why he was wearing it. None of us actually wanted to do that. We joked about following him, but we did not. Eventually, we walked away. I expected that to be the end of the story. For the next few days, we mentioned the plague doctor at school. It became one of those small jokes shared between friends. Whenever someone coughed, one of us would say the doctor was coming. If someone wore black, we asked where their mask was. None of us thought the man would appear again. A few days later, we saw the car for the first time. School had finished, and we were standing near the entrance, deciding where to go. Cars moved slowly along the road as parents collected students. One of my friends pointed toward a dark car passing the school. There he is. I looked. The driver was wearing the plague doctor mask. I only saw him for a few seconds, but the long black beak was impossible to mistake. He drove slowly past the school. His head remained facing forward. The windows were closed, and I could not see anyone else inside. We laughed again, but this time the laughter felt different. It was more nervous. "What are the chances?" someone asked. One of my friends suggested that he lived nearby. That made sense. Aldi was not far from the school. If he lived or worked in the area, seeing him twice was not impossible. Still, why was he driving while wearing the mask? It seemed dangerous. The eye lenses were small and dark. I could not understand how he could see the road properly. We watched until the car disappeared. About 10 minutes later, it passed the school again. This time it came from the opposite direction. The plague doctor was still behind the wheel. He drove slowly. As the car passed us, his head moved slightly. It looked as though he turned toward us. None of us spoke until he was gone. "Okay," one of my friends said. That was strange. We tried to joke about it, but the mood had changed. After that, we started seeing the car regularly. Not every day. Sometimes several days passed without anything happening. Then we would look up and see the same car driving slowly near the school. It often appeared shortly before classes began or just after they ended. Sometimes it passed only once. Other times it drove by 2 or 3 times. We began recognizing the sound of the engine before we saw it. Whenever a similar car approached, one of us would say, "Here comes the plague doctor." Usually it was another driver, but often enough it was him. The black mask was always there, the long beak, the dark eye lenses, the same dark clothing. He never waved, he never stopped, he never spoke. He only drove past. At first, we believed it was a coincidence. Then we started noticing him in other places. One afternoon, a friend and I walked to a small shop after school. As we crossed the car park, the dark car was parked near the exit. The plague doctor sat behind the wheel. He appeared to be watching the road. When we noticed him, he started the engine and drove away. Another time, several of us were walking near a park when the car passed us. It reached the end of the road, turned around, and came back. The driver did not look directly at us, but he slowed as he passed. We stopped laughing about it. Every time the car appeared, we started checking behind us. We discussed going to a teacher or telling our parents. But what could we say? A man wearing a strange mask had driven near us several times. He had not threatened us. He had not spoken to us. He had not left the car. For all we knew, he lived nearby and enjoyed wearing the mask. Perhaps he was part of a group. Perhaps he worked at a haunted attraction. Perhaps there was a completely harmless explanation. We did not want adults to laugh at us. We also did not want to create trouble for someone who had technically done nothing wrong. So we kept it between ourselves. The joke slowly became a warning. If one of us saw the car, we told the others. We began walking home together more often. We paid attention to number plates. but none of us managed to remember the full registration. We were always too focused on the mask. Looking back, we should have taken a photograph. We all had phones. But whenever the car appeared, it happened so quickly that nobody thought clearly enough to record it. Part of the problem was that the man's behavior was never dramatic. He did not jump out and chase us. He did not shout through the window. He did not follow close enough to make it obvious. He always stayed at the edge of what could be called normal. That made us question ourselves. Maybe we were imagining a pattern because the mask had made such a strong impression on us. Maybe there were several people wearing similar masks. Maybe the car only seemed to appear often because we were now watching for it. One afternoon, however, it became much harder to dismiss. There were 4 of us walking home from school. The weather was gray, and the streets were quiet. We had taken our usual route, which went through a residential area before splitting into different roads near our homes. We were talking about school and not paying attention to the traffic. Then, one of my friends looked behind us. His face changed. "The car is back." We all turned. The dark car was moving slowly along the road behind us. The plague doctor was driving. He was far enough away that we could not clearly see the eye lenses, but the shape of the beak was easy to recognize. We continued walking. The car stayed behind us. There was enough space for it to pass. The road was clear. But it did not pass. It moved at the same slow speed as us. We stopped talking. The sound of the engine followed us down the street. One friend suggested we turn into a smaller road and see what happened. We did. The car turned too. That was when the fear became real. Until then, there had always been the possibility that we were overreacting. But this no longer felt accidental. We walked faster. The car continued behind us. It did not rush forward. It did not come close enough to touch us. It only followed. I looked over my shoulder several times. The plague doctor's face remained pointed in our direction. The black mask made it impossible to know where he was looking. The eye lenses reflected the dull afternoon light. We started discussing what to do in quiet, urgent voices. One friend said we should run. Another said running might make the driver react. Someone suggested going to the nearest house and asking an adult for help. I remember feeling embarrassed even while I was afraid. Part of me still worried that we would look foolish if the car simply drove away. Teenagers often care about looking stupid even when they may be in danger. We crossed the road. The car slowed and then followed. At that point, none of us were joking. My heart was beating fast. I kept expecting the door to open. I imagined the man stepping out in the long black mask and coming after us. But he remained inside. We reached a corner where our normal route divided. Instead of separating, we stayed together. Nobody wanted to walk home alone. We turned toward a busier road where there would be shops, traffic, and other people. The dark car remained behind us for another minute. Then, it suddenly accelerated. It drove past without stopping. As it came beside us, all 4 of us turned to look. The plague doctor faced forward. For one moment, I thought I saw his head begin to turn. Then, the car passed. It reached the next junction and disappeared. We stood on the pavement, watching the empty road. No one said anything for several seconds. Finally, one friend laughed. It was not because anything was funny. It was the kind of laugh people make after avoiding something dangerous. We waited together for a long time before continuing. We kept checking every road and driveway. The car did not return. That was the last time we ever saw the plague doctor. After weeks of appearances, he disappeared completely. The car never passed our school again. We never saw him near Aldi, the park, the shops, or the streets where we walked home. Nothing happened to any of us. There were no messages, no threats, No strange objects left outside our houses. Nobody went missing. No police ever came to ask us questions. Life continued. Eventually, the fear faded. The plague doctor became a story we told when we were together. Every few months, someone would ask, "Do you remember that man?" Of course, we all remembered. We discussed possible explanations many times. Maybe he was trying to frighten people for fun. Maybe he recognized us from Aldi and enjoyed watching our reactions. Maybe he was filming videos from inside the car. Maybe he lived near the school and the repeated sightings were coincidences. One friend believed there had been more than one person. He thought the mask belonged to a local group or online trend we had never heard of. Another friend was certain the man had been following us. He believed the plague doctor only stopped because we reached a busier road. I never knew what to believe. Even now, years later, I can still see the man standing in Aldi. He had looked completely calm. He did not move like someone playing a joke. He did not seem excited by the attention. He appeared comfortable inside the mask, as though it were something he wore every day. That memory bothers me more now than it did at the time. There is another small detail I have never been able to explain. When we first saw him in Aldi, I remember his clothes clearly. He wore dark trousers and a long black coat. When we later saw him driving near school, he appeared to be wearing the same clothes. Every time. The same coat. The same gloves. The same mask. It did not matter whether the weather was warm or cold. Nothing about him seemed to change. Perhaps that only proves he wanted to be recognized. Perhaps the entire point was to create a character that people would remember. If that was his goal, it worked. My friends and I are older now. Some of us have moved away. We do not speak as often as we once did, but whenever we meet, the plague doctor eventually enters the conversation. Someone brings up Aldi. Another person remembers the car outside school. Then we talk about the afternoon when it followed us. Our memories are mostly the same. That matters to me. It would be easier to believe I had exaggerated the whole thing over the years if my friends remembered it differently. They do not. They remember the same mask, the same car, the same slow driving, the same feeling that we were being watched. One of my friends recently claimed he saw a dark car parked near his house late at night. He sent a message to our old group chat asking if anyone else remembered the registration number. None of us did. He said the driver was not wearing a mask, at least not that he could see. By the time he went outside, the car was gone. It was probably nothing. There are thousands of dark cars. Still, the message brought every old memory back. For several nights afterward, I found myself looking through the window before going to bed. I checked parked cars more carefully when I left work. I watched my mirrors while driving home. I never saw the plague doctor. I hope I never do. Maybe he was only a strange man who enjoyed wearing an unusual mask. Maybe he had no interest in us at all. Maybe everything that happened had a harmless explanation. But I still remember the way his car stayed behind us on that quiet road. There was enough space to pass. There was no traffic. He chose to remain there. He matched our walking speed. He followed when we turned. And when we finally reached a road filled with other people, he drove away. That was not imagination. That was not a joke. Whoever the plague doctor was, he wanted us to know he was there. I just do not know why. I had been sitting on the beach for almost 2 hours, waiting for my name to be called. The sun was high, the sand was hot, and every minute felt longer than the one before it. My wetsuit was starting to feel uncomfortable, and I kept shifting my position, trying to stop the sand from sticking to everything. Around me, the other students were doing the same thing. Some were talking. Some were checking their equipment. Others were staring out at the water, waiting for the instructor to finally pay attention. This was supposed to be the final rescue test for our diving course. When my turn came, I would have to swim out to the dive buoy, go down about 15 feet, find an unresponsive diver, bring them back to the surface, and perform CPR. We had practiced the steps several times. It was not meant to be dangerous. The assistants would be underwater, watching us and making sure nothing went wrong. At least, that was how it was supposed to work. The main instructor did not seem interested in the test anymore. He had spent most of the afternoon talking to one of the girls in our class. Her name was Susie, and she was standing near him in her wetsuit, laughing politely while he leaned against the stack of diving tanks and acted like he had nowhere else to be. There were still several students waiting on the beach, including me, and around 10 people were already in the water. My older sister was one of them. I had seen her swim out earlier, but I could not remember seeing her return. At first, I told myself I had probably missed her. There were people moving back and forth along the shoreline, carrying equipment, pulling off fins, and talking over one another. It would have been easy for her to come out of the water without me noticing. Still, the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. I kept touching the medallion hanging around my neck. It was a small image of St. Brendan the Voyager, given to me by my mother. She had given an identical one to my sister. Our mother was not the kind of person who forced religion on us, but she believed St. Brendan protected sailors and travelers at sea. Before we started the course, she had placed both medallions in our hands and told us to wear them whenever we went diving. My sister had laughed, but she had promised. I had worn mine every time. After another few minutes, I finally stood up and walked over to the instructor. He was a thin, wiry man with curly hair and deeply tanned skin. He looked like someone who had spent his entire life under the sun. His face was lined and dry, and he always wore the same expression, as though everyone around him was wasting his time. He had made it clear from the beginning that he did not enjoy teaching teenagers. He spoke to us like we were stupid, even when we followed instructions correctly. Yet whenever he spoke to the girls, especially Susie, his attitude changed completely. I stopped beside him and waited for him to notice me. He did not. "Did my sister come back up?" I asked. He turned slowly, clearly annoyed that I had interrupted him. "What?" "My sister," I repeated. "Did she finish her test?" He glanced toward the water, but only for a second. "She's still out there." I looked toward the buoy. The waves were rough enough that it kept disappearing from sight. "Is she okay?" He sighed. "She's playing the victim. It's your turn to rescue her." Then he waved one hand toward the water. "Go on. You're up." That was all he said. He did not check my equipment. He did not start a timer. He did not call the assistant instructors on the radio. He simply turned back to Susie and continued his conversation. I stood there for a moment, staring at him. I was angry, but I was also worried about my sister. I could not see either of the two assistants who were supposed to be helping with the test. I assumed they were already underwater, evaluating the other students. I returned to my equipment and tried to focus. I tightened my weight belt, checked the straps on my buoyancy control vest, and made sure my air tank was secure. Then I carried my fins into the shallow water. Anyone who has worn diving fins knows how awkward they are on land. Walking forward in them is almost impossible, so I put them on once the water reached my ankles and began stepping backwards into the surf. The waves pushed against my legs. Cold water entered my wetsuit around my neck and wrists. When the water reached my chest, I stopped. I held the medallion in my hand and kissed it. It was something I always did before a dive. I had never thought much about it. It was simply a habit, like checking my air pressure or adjusting my mask. Then I turned around and began swimming toward the buoy. The water was much rougher than it had looked from the beach. Each wave lifted me and dropped me again. I tried to keep my breathing slow through the snorkel, but the constant movement made my stomach turn. The red and yellow buoy appeared between the waves, then vanished again. I kept my face in the water and watched the seabed below me. At first I could see sand, patches of seagrass, and the shadows of small fish moving beneath me. The water was not perfectly clear, but the visibility was good enough. I expected to reach the buoy within a few minutes. When I raised my head again, it was gone. I stopped swimming and turned in a circle. There was nothing ahead of me except open water and the horizon. For a few seconds, I felt completely lost. The buoy had been my only marker. Without it, there was no clear line between where I was and where I needed to go. I turned back toward shore and felt a little calmer when I saw the beach. It looked farther away than I expected. The people near the equipment tables were now small figures. I could not tell one person from another. I began to wonder if a current had pulled me away from the test area. That thought frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Riptides had always terrified me. I knew the rules. Do not fight the current directly. Swim parallel to the shore. Stay calm. Signal for help. Knowing what to do did not stop the fear. I searched the water again. Finally, I spotted the buoy to my left, rising on top of a swell before dropping out of view. Its red flag, marked with a white stripe, moved in the wind. I turned toward it and continued swimming. This time, I refused to take my eyes off it for more than a few seconds. My stomach was getting worse, but I kept going. As I moved closer, something began to feel wrong. The buoy looked old. From the beach, it had seemed bright and clean, but now I could see dark patches covering the sides. Barnacles had grown around the lower section. The red and white paint was faded and peeling away. I slowed down. I knew it was the same type of buoy, but it did not look like the one our instructor had brought that morning. That one had been almost new. I told myself the salt water and sunlight were making it appear worse than it was. Maybe it had always been damaged, and I simply had not noticed from shore. I reached the buoy and grabbed the nylon line attached beneath it. Then I placed my regulator in my mouth, pressed the purge valve, and released the air from my vest. My weight belt pulled me down. The waves disappeared above my head, and the world became quiet. That was normally my favorite part of diving. Everything changed underwater. The noise from the beach vanished. The movement of the waves became slower and softer. All I could hear was the steady hiss of air entering my regulator and the rush of bubbles leaving it. The water was warm, and for the first few seconds, I felt calm. Visibility was good. I could see at least 40 or 50 feet in every direction. But I could not see the bottom. That did not make sense. The test was supposed to take place in water around 15 or 20 feet deep. I should have seen the sand below me almost immediately. Instead, there was only green water fading into darkness. I followed the buoy line downward. I thought the current might have dragged the buoy away from the shallow area. If that was true, I expected to see the seabed sloping upward somewhere nearby. I continued sinking. The line stretched below me, disappearing into the murk. After several seconds, I looked at my vest. The red sections of the material were beginning to turn dark. Colors change as you go deeper underwater. Red disappears first because the water absorbs it. Seeing the red fabric become almost black meant I was much deeper than I should have been. I checked the gauges attached to my equipment. One showed my remaining air pressure, the other showed my depth. Both needles were moving wildly. They swung back and forth so fast that I could not read them. My breathing changed immediately. The regulator hissed loudly with every breath. Bubbles burst past my mask as I exhaled. I could hear myself breathing faster, and the sound made the panic worse. I was already known for using more air than the other students. The instructor called me an air hog. I breathed too heavily underwater, especially when I became nervous. I forced myself to inhale slowly. It did not work. Every part of my mind was telling me to leave. Go back. Get to the surface. Something is wrong. I pressed the inflator button on my vest and added air. Normally, that would slow my descent and help me float upward. I continued sinking. I pressed it again. Nothing changed. The surface was no longer visible above me. The light had become dim, and the water around me was filled with small particles. My visibility had dropped to around 10 or 15 feet. I told myself I could not be deeper than 50 feet. Our certification only allowed us to dive to around 60 feet. I had never gone beyond that. I reached for the oral inflation tube attached to my left shoulder. With one hand, I pulled the regulator from my mouth. With the other, I blew air directly into the vest. Then, I placed the regulator back in my mouth and took another breath. I repeated the process several times. Blow into the vest. Breathe from the regulator. Blow into the vest again. The vest still did not lift me. I began kicking hard, trying to swim upward through force alone. My legs moved faster and faster. I pulled through the water with my arms, but I felt as though I were swimming against something much stronger than a current. The yellow markings on my gauge darkened to gray. Yellow disappears deeper than red. I was below the depth I had been trained for. I was still going down. I stopped trying to understand the gauges. I reached for the buckle on my weight belt and pulled. The belt came loose immediately. For 1 second, it floated beside me. Then, the heavy weights turned downward and disappeared into the darkness. My body stopped sinking. I remained suspended in the water, breathing hard and staring below me. The nylon line from the buoy was still nearby, but I could no longer see where it ended. It continued down into the green darkness like a rope hanging into an endless hole. Around me, the water began to move. Clouds of silt turned in slow circles. It looked like sediment disturbed by divers near the bottom, but there was no bottom in sight. The particles formed long, twisting shapes. They moved around me in wide spirals, catching the weak light and glowing faintly. It should have terrified me. Instead, I felt calm. The sudden peace came so strongly that I almost forgot where I was. The moving silt was beautiful. It looked like smoke rolling through the water, or paint spreading through glass. The currents pushed the colors into new shapes, and I found myself staring at them. My breathing slowed. The panic disappeared. The pressure around me no longer felt dangerous. The darkness seemed warm and safe. I thought I could rest there, just for a moment. I could close my eyes and let the water hold me. I do not know how long my eyes were closed. When I opened them again, I was no longer alone. Other divers were floating around me. They were students from my class. Their bodies were suspended inside the swirling green water. Some were upright. Some leaned sideways. Others hung with their heads lowered and their arms moving gently with the current. It looked like we were trapped inside a slow underwater tornado. Soft light moved through the silt. Everything felt warm. Peaceful, I remember thinking that there was no reason to fight it. I could close my eyes again. I could sleep. Then, one clear thought entered my mind. This is wrong. The thought did not feel like my own at first. It was sharp and sudden, cutting through the calm. I shook my head inside my mask. My body felt heavy. My thoughts were slow. I tried to focus on my hands, my breathing, and the regulator between my teeth. Without thinking, I reached for the medallion around my neck. The moment my fingers closed around it, the sleepy feeling weakened. Not completely, but enough. I looked around again and finally understood what was happening. We were all sinking. The spiral of silt was pulling us downward. It moved so slowly that it was difficult to notice, but the water above us was becoming darker. The pressure in my ears was increasing. There were 4 other students close enough for me to see. I could not see either of the assistant instructors. I recognized my sister by her long brown hair, tied in a ponytail behind her head. Her eyes were closed. Bubbles still came from her regulator, which meant she was breathing, but her body was completely relaxed. 2 other students were floating upside down. No bubbles came from either of them. I kicked toward my sister. The water resisted me. It felt thick, almost like I was pushing through oil, but I managed to reach her. I grabbed both of her shoulders and shook her. Her eyes opened slightly. Then they closed again. I shook her harder. She looked at me for a second, but there was no recognition in her face. She seemed tired, almost happy. I looked at her neck. Her medallion was missing. Maybe she had forgotten it at home. Maybe she had removed it before entering the water. I had no idea. I pulled mine over my head and pressed it against the skin of her arm. Her reaction was immediate. Her eyes opened wide. She inhaled sharply through the regulator, and a burst of bubbles rushed past her face. She looked around, saw the darkness, and began to panic. I grabbed her vest and held her still. She tried to push me away, but I kept shaking my head and pointing at her regulator. Breathe slowly. Stay calm. After a few seconds, she understood. I kept the medallion pressed between us and pulled her toward another diver. It was Jack, one of the older students in the class. He was still breathing, but his eyes were closed. My sister held his vest while I touched the medallion against his wrist. He woke almost instantly. His whole body jerked. His eyes moved quickly behind his mask, and he looked around in confusion. I held up one hand and signaled for him to stay calm. Then I pointed toward the 2 divers who were not breathing. We tried to reach them. The first was a boy named Michael. His regulator was still in his mouth, but his tank was empty. I checked his pressure gauge, even though I already knew what it would show. The needle was at 0. The second diver had lost her regulator. It hung beside her shoulder, moving gently with the current. Neither of them responded when we touched them. There was nothing we could do. I do not know how much air the rest of us had left. My own gauge was still moving wildly. My sister's gauge looked the same. Jack pointed at his tank, then held up a hand to show that he was running low. We had to leave. I turned in a circle, searching for the buoy line. It was gone. The rope had been beside me only moments before, but now there was nothing except the rotating green silt. I looked upward. There was no surface light. I looked downward. The darkness seemed even deeper. We needed to escape the spiral before trying to rise. I pointed toward the edge of the moving silt and began swimming. My sister followed close behind me, holding the back of my vest. Jack stayed beside her. The current tried to turn us back toward the center. Every kick felt weak. My muscles were becoming tired, and I could feel the calmness trying to return. The water seemed to whisper that we did not need to struggle. It promised warmth. Sleep, peace. I closed my hand around the medallion and kept swimming. When we reached the edge of the spiral, something stopped us. It was not a strong current. It felt like a wall. My hands pressed against invisible resistance. The surface bent around my fingers like thick rubber or skin. I pushed harder. For 1 second, I felt something push back. Then the barrier broke. All 3 of us moved through it at once. The water outside the spiral was colder and clearer. The calm feeling vanished. I looked behind us. The green cloud continued turning in the darkness, but its edges were now hard to see. It seemed to close over the place where we had escaped. We began swimming upward. This time, we rose. The water slowly became lighter. The colors returned to our equipment. First, the yellow markings appeared again, then the red sections of my vest. My lungs hurt from breathing so hard. We had to be careful not to rise too quickly, but none of us knew our true depth. Our gauges still did not work properly. I tried to slow us down, but fear kept pushing us upward. Halfway to the surface, Jack grabbed my arm. He pointed at his regulator. Then he shook his head. His tank was empty. He tried to take one more breath, but no air came. I pulled my regulator from my mouth and gave it to him. He inhaled immediately. We had practiced buddy breathing during training. One diver takes 2 breaths, then passes the regulator back. The second diver takes 2 breaths and returns it. In practice, it had been simple. In the darkness, with limited air and panic rising inside us, it was much harder. Jack took 2 breaths and handed the regulator back. I pulled in air as quickly as I could, then returned it to him. My sister stayed close, holding both of our vests to keep us together. We continued upward that way. Share the regulator. Kick. Wait. Share again. The water became brighter. I could finally see the broken shape of sunlight above us. The moment my head reached the surface, I pulled off my mask and breathed. The air felt painful in my lungs. My sister surfaced beside me. Jack came up a second later, coughing and holding on to my vest. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. Then I looked toward the beach. It was much farther away than it should have been. The dive buoy was gone. There was no red flag, no yellow body, no nylon rope, only open water. We shouted for help. At first, no one heard us. We began swimming toward shore, supporting Jack between us. My arms and legs felt weak, but fear kept me moving. Eventually, someone on the beach saw us. People entered the water. The instructor and several adults swam out with rescue floats. When they reached us, the instructor kept asking where the others were. None of us could answer. Emergency services searched the area for hours. Boats moved back and forth across the water. Divers entered near the location we described. Later, the Coast Guard joined the search. They found nothing. 6 students and both assistant instructors disappeared during that dive. Their bodies were never recovered. The main instructor was arrested and later charged with negligence. Investigators discovered that he had not been properly supervising the test. He had lost track of how many students were in the water and had failed to notice that the assistants had not returned. He was eventually convicted. The official explanation for what happened underwater was nitrogen narcosis. They said we must have gone much deeper than expected. At extreme depths, nitrogen can affect the brain. It can cause confusion, happiness, fear, poor judgment, and hallucinations. They said the peaceful feeling was part of it. They said the green spiral was probably disturbed sediment. They said the missing buoy may have been a hallucination. They even suggested some of the divers could have removed their own masks or regulators while confused. I listened to all of it. My sister listened too. Neither of us believed them. Nitrogen narcosis might explain the calmness. It might explain confused memories or strange colors in the water. It does not explain why all of us were trapped in the same place. It does not explain the invisible barrier around the spiral. It does not explain how touching the medallion woke my sister and Jack. It does not explain why the buoy I followed looked old and covered in barnacles. And it does not explain why 8 people vanished without leaving a single body. Tank, fin, mask, or piece of equipment behind. Something was down there. something pulled us away from the shallow water and dragged us into the dark. Something made us feel safe while we were drowning. My sister and I rarely speak about that day. When we do, the conversation never lasts long. One of us usually changes the subject. Neither of us has gone diving since. But we still wear our medallions of saint. Brendan, the Voyager. My sister bought another one after she came home from the hospital. It looks exactly like the one our mother gave her. Mine is scratched now. The metal has lost its shine, and the chain has been replaced more than once. I still wear it. I do not know whether it saved us. I only know that when I held it, I woke up. And sometimes, late at night, I dream about the green water. In the dream, I am back inside the spiral. The missing divers are floating below me, their eyes closed, slowly turning in the dark. Far beneath them, something enormous moves through the silt. I can never see its full shape. I only see part of it passing under us, deep in the darkness. Then the peaceful feeling returns. A voice that is not a voice tells me to close my eyes. It tells me I am tired. It tells me there is nothing to fear. And every time, just before I fall asleep inside the dream, I reach for the medallion around my neck. Then I wake up, holding it. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. When I was little, my parents would sometimes take me to visit my grandmother. I hated those trips. Her house was far away from town, hidden deep in the countryside, where the roads became narrow, the trees grew close together, and the nearest neighbor lived far enough away that you could not see their house from the front porch. There was no television, no computer, and almost nothing for a child to do inside. The drive always felt much longer than it really was. I would sit in the back seat and complain the entire way there, then start complaining again as soon as we left. My grandmother did not make the visits any more interesting. Most of the time, she slept in a chair near the window or stayed in her bedroom. When she was awake, she often seemed confused. She would stare at parts of the room where no one was standing, whisper names under her breath, or begin talking about things that had happened years before I was born. My parents told me not to worry about it. They said she was not quite right in the head anymore. At that age, I did not understand what that meant. I only knew that my grandmother sometimes frightened me without meaning to. She could look at me for a long time as if she was trying to remember who I was. Then, she would suddenly smile and call me by another name. Sometimes she called me Olive. I did not know anyone named Olive. Whenever I asked my parents about it, they told me it was probably someone my grandmother had known when she was younger. They never seemed concerned, so I tried not to be concerned either. During most visits, I escaped into the woods surrounding the house. My parents allowed me to explore as long as I followed one rule. I was not supposed to go farther than the point where I could still see the house. The property was large, but the woods were not especially dangerous during the day. There were no cliffs or deep rivers nearby. My parents mainly worried that I would become lost. I usually stayed close. I collected leaves, strange stones, feathers, and pieces of bark. Sometimes I built small shelters between the trees. Other times I imagined that I was an explorer searching a wild country no one else had ever entered. The forest gave me something to do while the adults sat inside talking quietly. One afternoon, my parents needed to drive into town to run errands. I do not remember exactly what they needed. I only remember that I begged them to take me with them. I did not want to remain alone with my grandmother. My mother told me they would only be gone for a short time. My father reminded me that I had stayed there before and nothing bad had happened. My grandmother was asleep in her chair when they left. I stood at the front window and watched the car disappear down the road. The sound of the engine faded, leaving the house completely quiet. For a few minutes, I remained inside. The ticking clock in the living room sounded unusually loud. My grandmother breathed slowly in her chair, her mouth slightly open. Every so often, she muttered something in her sleep. I moved closer once, trying to understand her. "Olive," she whispered. Then she said something I could not hear. I backed away. When she woke a short time later, I asked whether I could go outside. She looked at me as if she had forgotten I was there. Then she nodded. "Stay where I can see you," she said. Her voice was weak and rough. I promised I would. I went into the woods and began collecting pieces of wood. I have no idea what I intended to do with them. I may have been planning to build a small fort or a pile for an imaginary fire. Whatever the reason was, it became the least important part of what happened that day. At first, I remained within the area my parents had allowed me to explore. I found fallen branches beneath the trees and carried them to a small clearing. Most were damp or rotten. The useful pieces disappeared quickly. I wanted longer, straighter sticks. I looked farther into the forest. The trees continued down a gentle slope, and sunlight passed through the leaves in narrow golden lines. Nothing about the woods looked frightening. Birds called above me, and insects moved through the grass. I turned toward my grandmother's house. I could still see part of the roof between the trees. I decided to go a little farther, only a little. I told myself I would turn around as soon as the house disappeared from view. I walked downhill, finding better branches as I went. Each time I stopped, I looked back. The house became harder to see. First, the lower walls vanished behind the slope. Then, only the roof and chimney remained. I knew I should have turned around. Instead, I noticed a large oak tree farther ahead. It was easily the biggest tree on the property. Its trunk was so wide that several adults would have needed to join hands to reach around it. Its branches spread across the sky, blocking much of the sunlight. Dozens of fallen sticks lay around its roots. They were exactly what I had been searching for. I hurried toward the oak and began gathering them. Within minutes, my arms were full. I tried to carry too many at once, and several slipped from the pile. I crouched to pick one up. When I stood again, I noticed something carved into the trunk. The letters were deep and neat. They looked far too careful to have been scratched by a child with a small knife. Whoever had made them had taken time, cutting each line into the wood until the words were easy to read. Olive and Ivy. The carving looked old. The bark had grown around the letters, softening their edges. Dark dirt had settled inside the cuts. I thought the names might have been there for decades. Ivy was my grandmother's name. I did not know anyone named Olive, but the name was familiar. My grandmother said it often. Sometimes she whispered it while sleeping. Sometimes she said it while staring through a window. I had always assumed it was one of the nonsense words my parents warned me not to worry about. Now I was standing in front of that name, carved beside hers on a tree deep in the woods. I placed the sticks on the ground. Then I reached out and touched the carving. The grooves felt rough beneath my fingers. The wood inside them was cold. For a second, I imagined two girls standing beneath the oak many years earlier, laughing while one of them carved their names into the trunk. Then, something tugged my hair. It was not the wind. The pull was light but clear, as though someone had taken a few strands between two fingers. I spun around. No one was there. The woods looked exactly as they had moments before. The branches moved gently above me. Leaves shifted across the ground. I could see several feet in every direction. There was nowhere for another person to hide. I stood still and listened. Nothing. Despite my curiosity, I was still an easily frightened child. I forgot about the sticks and started running toward my grandmother's house. "Grandma," I called. My voice sounded small beneath the trees. I had only gone a short distance when something caught my ankle. I fell forward. My face struck the leaves, and dirt filled my mouth. The impact hurt, but I did not feel a branch or root beneath my foot. I rolled over quickly. Nothing was behind me. I looked at my shoes, expecting to find a vine wrapped around one of them. There was nothing. I started crying. I was not badly injured. My hands were dirty, and one knee hurt, but fear had already taken control of me. I pushed myself up. Before I could stand, something grabbed my arm. Invisible fingers closed around my wrist. I was pulled upright with enough force to make my shoulder hurt. I screamed. No one was there. My arm remained raised for 1 second, held by something I could not see. Then the pressure released. I stumbled backward. The leaves in front of me moved. Small dents appeared one after another, pressing into the ground. They looked like footprints, human footprints, but there were no feet inside them. The marks moved away from me, heading toward the oak tree. I remained frozen. After several steps, the invisible footprints stopped. The woods became silent. I could feel something watching me. It was not the normal feeling of being alone in a forest. It felt focused, as though someone stood directly in front of me and waited for me to follow. I took one careful step. A new footprint appeared in the leaves. Then another. The unseen person continued walking toward the oak. I stopped again. The footprints stopped too. The pressure of being watched became stronger. I understood what it wanted. It wanted me to follow. I was still crying, but I did not scream again. I wiped my face with my sleeve and walked after the prints. Whenever I slowed, they slowed. Whenever I stopped, they stopped. The invisible presence never touched me again, but I knew it could. I followed obediently. The prints led me back to the large oak. They stopped at the base of the trunk. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the leaves around one of the roots began moving. They were thrown aside in small handfuls. No hands were visible, but the ground slowly cleared until a patch of dark soil appeared. Before I could step away, something pushed me. I fell onto my knees. This time, I caught myself with both hands before my face struck the earth. I looked around. The feeling of being watched became almost painful. It seemed to press against the back of my head. Whenever I looked away from the bare patch of soil, the pressure increased. I looked down again. The feeling weakened. I understood another command. Dig. I pushed my fingers into the dirt. The soil was soft near the surface, but harder underneath. Small stones cut my fingertips. Dirt packed beneath my nails. As I dug, I tried to think of a way to escape. If I ran, the invisible thing would probably trip me again. If I shouted for my grandmother, she might not hear me. Even if she did, she moved slowly and became confused easily. My parents were in town. No one else lived nearby. I kept digging. After a few minutes, my fingers struck something hard. Metal. I cleared the soil around it and pulled out a small box. It was rectangular and badly rusted. Most of the paint had peeled away, and the remaining pieces flaked off against my hands. The box was extremely cold, colder than the soil, colder than the air. The moment I lifted it, a sound came from deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was a fox. I had heard foxes make strange cries at night, though this was still daytime. I listened. The sound came again. It was a child crying. The voice seemed far away, but clear enough that I could hear small breaths between the sobs. I stood. "Hello?" I called. The crying stopped. I held the box against my chest and looked between the trees. "Are you okay?" No one answered. I started moving toward the sound. The invisible force grabbed me again. I was pulled down so violently that my knees struck the ground. My hands slammed against the earth, and the metal box fell between them. The lid opened with a loud clang. A photograph rested on top of the objects inside. A little girl stared up at me. For one confused second, I thought it was a photograph of myself. The girl had hair almost exactly like mine. Her eyes were the same shape and color. Even the curve of her eyebrows looked familiar. But the clothing was wrong. She wore an old-school uniform, the kind children wore in black and white photographs from many years earlier. She was looking directly at the camera. Her eyes were smiling. Her mouth was not. I had always been able to notice the difference between a real smile and a false one. Some people smiled only with their mouths. Their faces changed, but their eyes stayed cold. This girl was doing the opposite. Her lips were straight, but there was warmth and happiness in her eyes. I turned the photograph over. Someone had written 2 words on the back. Olive, 1945. I read the name several times. Olive, the person my grandmother spoke about, the name beside hers on the tree. I looked back at the oak. The carving was above me. Olive and ivy. The crying began again. It sounded closer now. I placed the photograph beside the box and looked through the other objects. Several thick pieces of paper had been stacked beneath it. Each one held a small watercolor painting. There were flowers, trees, birds, and a lake surrounded by tall grass. The colors had faded, but the paintings were careful and detailed. Every picture had been signed in pencil. Olive, they did not look like the work of someone described as mad. They looked gentle. Peaceful, underneath the paintings, I found a crumpled piece of paper. The crying grew louder when I touched it. I slowly unfolded the paper. It held a child's drawing. A girl stood on top of a hill. She had long, sharp fingers, pointed teeth, and wild hair. Her mouth was open as if she were laughing. Behind her, orange and red lines showed a large fire. The picture was rough and angry, nothing like the watercolor paintings. I found several more crumpled drawings. In one, a woman chased children away from a hill. In another, a girl screamed beneath a dark sky. One showed a small child tied to a chair, while tall figures stood around her. The crying continued. It was no longer far away. It sounded as though someone was kneeling directly beside me, sobbing into their hands. I turned in a circle. Nothing. The voice came from everywhere. I became angry. I did not understand why the invisible thing had brought me there, or what it wanted. I only wanted to go back to the house. I crushed the drawings into balls again and threw them beside the box. Then I pressed my palm against them, flattening them into the dirt. The crying stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. I looked at the box again. An old letter lay beneath the drawings. The words had been typed on yellow paper. I could not read well at that age, but the sentences were simple enough for me to understand most of them. Dear Mrs. Ainsworth, following Olive's visit to Dr. Harper's practice, it has been determined that the girl appears to be of an unsound mind. Despite her obvious failings in language ability, nervousness and hyperactivity were observed, and Dr. Harper has diagnosed her with lunacy. We recommend that Olive undergo immediate intervention to keep her calm. I read it slowly. Some words meant nothing to me. I understood nervousness. I understood that a doctor thought Olive was wrong in the head. My parents had used similar words when speaking about my grandmother. The crying returned. This time, it was not the frightened crying of a lost child. It was heavy sobbing, the kind of crying that made it difficult to breathe. I lowered the letter. A toy had been pushed into one corner of the box. It was a small gray rabbit. The fur was worn flat and matted from years of being held. One ear leaned to the side, and part of the stitching had come loose near the neck. It looked like a toy someone had loved. For a moment, the rabbit seemed harmless. Then I noticed a dark stain on one ear. Even after all those years, it looked like dried blood. I reached toward it. A scream tore through the forest. It was so loud and sharp that I fell backward. Birds exploded from the branches above me. The sound went on for several seconds, rising and falling, until it became almost impossible to tell whether it was a human voice or an animal. Then, it stopped. I stared into the woods. I knew I would not see anyone. Still, I expected a girl to step from between the trees. No one came. I looked back into the box. Another photograph lay at the bottom. This one showed two girls. They were inside a room, posing beside a large wooden chair. The first girl sat carefully on the arm of the chair. Her hair was brushed and arranged neatly. She wore a clean dress and sat with perfect posture. She smiled widely at the camera, but her eyes did not smile. They remained completely still. I did not recognize her at first. Then I realized she had to be Ivy, my grandmother. She looked different as a child, but there were parts of her face I knew. The shape of her nose, the line of her jaw, the way one eyebrow sat slightly higher than the other. The second girl was sitting in the chair. Olive, she looked nothing like the girl in the first photograph. Her school uniform was gone. She wore a loose nightgown instead. Her hair had not been brushed. It was knotted and spread around her face. She did not smile. The happiness had disappeared from her eyes. There was nothing behind them now. No warmth, no fear, no anger. Nothing. She looked like someone who had been emptied. I moved the photograph closer. A thin, dark line ran above one of Olive's eyes. At first, I thought it was a scratch on the picture. Then I saw the small marks along it. Stitches, a row of stitches, ran across her forehead. Even through the brown color of the old photograph, I could see blood around them. I remembered the letter, immediate intervention to keep her calm. I did not understand exactly what had been done to Olive. I knew it had hurt her. The sobbing had stopped. The feeling of being watched returned. It was stronger than before. My skin tightened. The air around me felt colder. I turned the photograph over. Two names had been written on the back: Olive and Ivy. My hands began shaking. I looked at the neat girl sitting on the arm of the chair, my grandmother. Then I looked at Olive, the girl with my hair, my eyes, my face. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around. No one stood there. The leaves near the oak moved. A new footprint appeared. Then another. They circled me slowly. I tried to stand, but something pressed down on both shoulders. The photograph slipped from my hands. It landed face up between my knees. Olive stared at me with empty eyes. The footprints stopped. A voice whispered beside my ear. Ivy, it sounded like a child. I screamed for my grandmother. The invisible pressure disappeared. I jumped to my feet and ran. This time, nothing tripped me. I did not follow the route I had taken earlier. I simply ran uphill, pushing through branches and bushes, searching for any sign of the house. Behind me, I heard footsteps. They were light and quick. A child running through leaves. I did not turn around. The footsteps came closer. I felt a hand brush my hair. Then the house appeared between the trees. I ran toward it, shouting, "Grandma." The back door stood open. I rushed inside and slammed it shut. My grandmother was no longer asleep in her chair. She stood in the middle of the kitchen. Her face was pale. For the first time I could remember, she did not look confused. She looked terrified. She stared at the muddy box in my hands. I had not realized I was still carrying it. "Where did you find that?" she asked. Her voice sounded stronger than usual. I tried to explain, but I was crying too hard. I told her about the tree, the footprints, the girl in the picture, the name Olive. My grandmother grabbed the box from me. She searched through its contents until she found the photograph of the two girls. Her hands began shaking. "She made you dig it up," she whispered. "Who?" My grandmother looked toward the window. Olive. The name sounded different when she said it clearly. Not like a confused word, not like nonsense. A name she remembered. "Was she your sister?" I asked. My grandmother closed her eyes. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she nodded. She was my twin. I looked at the photograph again. That explained why Olive looked like me. I had inherited the same face. What happened to her? My grandmother held the photograph against her chest. "She was not sick," she said. "She was different. She had trouble speaking. Loud sounds frightened her. She could not sit still when people told her to. But she painted beautiful things. She looked at the watercolor pictures. Our parents thought she embarrassed them." My grandmother's voice broke. "They took her to a doctor who promised to fix her." I remembered the stitches. "What did he do?" My grandmother stared at the floor. "He took pieces of her away." I did not understand. Not then. I only knew that Olive had returned home changed. My grandmother told me Olive stopped painting. She stopped talking. She spent most days holding the gray rabbit and staring through the window. Sometimes she screamed at night. Sometimes she ran into the woods and hid beneath the oak. The family kept her locked in a bedroom whenever visitors came. One winter, a fire started in the house. My grandmother never told me exactly how. She only said Olive was blamed. After that, Olive disappeared. The adults said she had been sent away. My grandmother knew they were lying. She had seen men carrying something wrapped in a blanket toward the woods. "Why was the box buried?" I asked. "I buried it," she said. She had gathered Olive's paintings, photographs, letters, and rabbit after the fire. She placed everything inside the metal box and buried it beneath the oak. She did not want her parents to destroy the last pieces of her sister. Why did she make me find it? My grandmother looked at me. For a moment, her eyes moved across my face as if she were seeing someone else. "She thought you were me." Something scratched the kitchen door. 3 slow lines. My grandmother became completely still. Another scratch followed. Then a child began to cry outside. I moved toward the window. My grandmother grabbed my arm. "Do not look." The crying became louder. It moved from the door to the side of the house. A small hand pressed against the kitchen window. There was no arm attached to it, only the shape of 5 fingers appearing in the misted glass from outside. My grandmother pulled the curtains shut. "She followed you home," she whispered. The house became quiet. Then the back door handle began to turn. My grandmother held the metal box tightly. "Olive," she said. The handle stopped. "I'm sorry." The lights flickered. A girl's voice came from the other side of the door. It sounded exactly like mine. "Open it, Ivy," my grandmother began crying. She looked older than she ever had before. "I should have stopped them," she whispered. "I should have helped you." The voice outside laughed. "You smiled for the picture." My grandmother looked at the photograph. The neat little girl on the arm of the chair was smiling with her mouth, not her eyes. "I was afraid," my grandmother said. "You watched." The door shook once in its frame. I was a child. So was I. Something struck the door hard enough to crack the wood. My grandmother opened the metal box and removed the gray rabbit. She held it against her chest. The dark stain on its ear looked wet now. Fresh blood ran across her fingers. I kept him safe, she said. The pounding stopped. For several seconds, there was no sound at all. Then the kitchen door slowly opened. It had still been locked. Cold air entered the room. Leaves moved across the floor. No one stood outside. A line of footprints appeared in the dirt beyond the doorway. They entered the kitchen. One, then another. They stopped in front of my grandmother. The gray rabbit lifted from her hands. It hung in the air as though an invisible child were holding it. My grandmother reached forward. Her fingers closed around empty space. "I missed you," she whispered. A shape slowly appeared in front of her. First, I saw tangled hair, then a pale nightgown, then the outline of a small girl. Olive looked exactly as she had in the second photograph. Her hair was knotted. Stitches ran above one eye. Blood covered the side of her face. She held the rabbit against her chest. Her eyes were empty. She turned toward me. The moment she saw my face, something changed. For the first time, she smiled. Not with her mouth, with her eyes. My grandmother stepped between us. "She isn't me," she said. Olive tilted her head. Then she looked back at my grandmother. The smile disappeared. The two sisters stood facing one another for a long time. One old, one still a child. Finally, Olive reached out and placed her hand against my grandmother's cheek. My grandmother closed her eyes. The kitchen filled with the smell of smoke. The walls around us darkened. For one horrible second, I saw flames moving through the room. I heard children screaming and adults shouting. The clean kitchen disappeared beneath black smoke. Then, everything returned to normal. Olive was gone. The rabbit lay on the floor. My grandmother collapsed. I ran to her and screamed for help, though there was no one nearby to hear me. My parents returned less than an hour later. They found me sitting beside my grandmother, holding her hand. She was alive, but she never fully recovered from that day. Afterward, she spoke about Olive more often. My parents believed the experience had made her confusion worse. They did not believe my story about the box, the footprints, or the girl in the kitchen. They said I had found old family items in the woods and frightened myself. The metal box disappeared before our next visit. My father claimed he had thrown it away. My grandmother told me he had buried it again. I never asked where. She died several years later. At her funeral, my mother gave me a small envelope that had been found beneath my grandmother's pillow. Inside was the photograph of Olive and Ivy. The same photograph from the box. My grandmother had written something beneath their names. "I am sorry I left you under the oak." I kept the photograph. Sometimes I wish I had not. The picture has changed over the years. At first, only Olive and Ivy appeared in it. Now there is a third child standing behind the chair. She has my hair, my eyes, my face, and every time I look at the photograph, she seems a little closer to the camera. I am sitting inside a cold storage room, slowly freezing to death as I type this. I had no choice but to lock myself in here. The only other option was to stay outside and let the people pounding on the freezer door tear me apart. I do not know whether this message will reach anyone. The signal inside this room keeps dropping, and my company phone is already down to 30%. Still, I need to leave some kind of record. Someone needs to know what happened inside this building. Maybe the police will find this later. Maybe the military will. Maybe no one will find it at all. I will start from the beginning. My name is Tyler. 6 months ago, I accepted a maintenance position at a private research facility outside the city. The place looked ordinary from the road. It was a wide concrete building surrounded by fencing, security cameras, and a guarded entrance. There was no company name on the front, only a small silver sign with an identification number. Most people who drove past probably assumed it was a warehouse or manufacturing plant. It was neither. Inside, researchers in clean white coats performed experiments on almost every kind of animal you could imagine. Monkeys, rats, rabbits, dogs, birds, insects, and fish were kept in separate sections of the facility. Some of the smaller creatures were stored in sealed environmental chambers. The larger animals were housed in reinforced rooms that could be cleaned from outside. The experiments were usually connected to viruses, neurological diseases, genetic mutations, or new forms of treatment. I was never given full details. That was above my clearance level. I did not ask questions either. My job had nothing to do with the research itself. I maintained the cooling units, electrical systems, ventilation controls, backup generators, and emergency alarms. I also inspected the fume hoods in the laboratories. A fume hood is supposed to protect the people working around dangerous substances. It pulls contaminated air away from the room and sends it into a filtration and ventilation system. When laboratory workers handle toxic samples, harmful fumes are meant to travel through the hood and safely disperse after passing through several filters. The important words are meant to. Nothing inside that facility was ever as safe as management claimed. Even during my first week, I noticed problems. Alarm sensors failed without warning. Air filters were used longer than they should have been. Electrical panels were patched instead of replaced. Some emergency lights did not work unless you hit the wall beside them. Whenever I reported these issues, my supervisor told me to make temporary repairs and submit a request for proper replacement parts. The parts rarely arrived. The facility cared more about keeping the experiments running than maintaining the systems that protected everyone inside. I should have left. Instead, I accepted the overtime and told myself it was not my problem. At approximately 3:30 this morning, an emergency alert woke me. The company phone was vibrating on a table beside my bed. A harsh alarm filled my apartment, similar to the tone used during emergency weather broadcasts. For a few seconds, I did not understand what was happening. I grabbed the phone and read the message. Tyler, it's Devin. We have a fume hood in alarm mode. Location is Biotech, East Wing, second floor, Lab 237. I'm heading there now, but I need you here immediately. Possible hazardous contamination. I read the message twice. In 6 months, I had received several after-hours calls, but never a full emergency alert. Lab 237 was in one of the restricted biotechnology sections. I had only entered it twice, both times to repair an airflow sensor while the room was empty. Perfect, I muttered. I got out of bed and dressed as quickly as I could. I ate half an energy bar, grabbed my keys, and left the apartment. The facility was about 10 minutes away, but the drive felt much longer. Rain began falling as soon as I pulled out of the parking lot. Within minutes, it became a heavy downpour. Water covered the windscreen faster than the wipers could remove it, and the road reflected the streetlights in long, broken shapes. I tried calling Devin twice. He did not answer. That was strange. If the leak was serious enough to trigger an emergency alert, he should have remained on the phone with security or the control room. I told myself he was already putting on protective equipment. When I reached the facility, I slowed near the gate. The security booth was empty. Both guards who worked the night shift were gone. The barrier had been raised, leaving the entrance open. I stopped for a few seconds and looked through the rain. The security monitors inside the booth were dark. I should have turned around then. Instead, I drove through the gate and parked near the main entrance. The building looked wrong. Most of the exterior lights were off. The facility normally remained brightly lit throughout the night because several departments worked around the clock. That morning, only a few emergency lights glowed near the roof. The rest of the building was dark. As soon as I stepped out of my car, I heard alarms coming from the east wing. They were loud enough to carry through the rain. I recognized the pattern immediately. Hazardous contamination. The sound made me stop. Those alarms were only supposed to activate when chemical or biological sensors detected something dangerous outside a contained workspace. This was not a simple equipment failure. I entered through the front doors using my security badge. The lobby was empty. The lights flickered once as I crossed the floor. Security? I called. No one answered. Rainwater dripped from my jacket and collected around my boots. I checked the main desk. A radio lay on the floor behind it. One of the security chairs had been knocked over. I noticed dark streaks across the desk, but the emergency lights were too weak for me to identify them. I did not investigate. I moved down the main corridor toward the locker room. The alarm became louder with each step. The hallways were deserted. Office doors stood open. A coffee cup had shattered near one wall, and papers were scattered across the floor. It looked as if people had left in a hurry. The contamination suits were stored in metal lockers beside the changing area. I selected one, checked the seals, and pulled it over my clothes. The suit was thick and difficult to move in, but it protected the entire body. The helmet had a clear face shield connected to a filtered air system. I sealed the helmet and tested the air supply. The small fan near my shoulder began humming. For a moment, the sound calmed me. I told myself the suit would keep me safe. I did not yet understand that the contamination was only one part of the danger. Before entering the east wing, I stopped at the engineering control room. The door had been left unlocked. Several monitors displayed ventilation readings from different parts of the building. Most of them showed normal numbers, but the screen for Lab 237 was flashing red. Airflow failure. Contaminant concentration critical. Emergency exhaust inactive. There was another message beneath it. Manual repair required. A list of instructions had been opened on the main computer. It described how to bypass the damaged exhaust control and restart the ventilation motor. The procedure looked simple enough. Reach the fume hood, close the glass barrier, remove the front panel, manually release the blocked ventilation damper, reset the system. I gathered the tools I needed and placed them in a sealed maintenance bag. Before leaving, I tried calling Devin again. The call went directly to voicemail. I told myself he had lost signal inside the laboratory. I left the control room and entered the east wing. The electronic doors were supposed to open only after scanning my badge. Several were already open. The deeper I moved into the wing, the worse the air looked. A thin mist covered the hallway at first. Then it became darker. Near Lab 237, the contamination had formed a thick cloud that filled the entire corridor. It was almost black beneath the red emergency lights. The particles moved slowly, curling around the walls and doors. I could see only a few feet in front of me. The suit's filter began working harder. The fan near my shoulder increased speed, and a warning light appeared inside my helmet. I checked the seal around my neck. It was still secure. The door to Lab 237 was open. I stepped inside. The alarm was almost painful at that distance. A sensor above the fume hood flashed red, while the ventilation duct released a repeating warning tone. I could not see anyone inside the room. The dark cloud was too thick. I followed the sound until I reached the fume hood. Its glass barrier had been left open. That was the first serious mistake. Whatever sample had released the contamination was still inside, and the open barrier allowed the fumes to spread directly into the laboratory. I grabbed the handle and pulled the glass door down. The alarm continued, but the cloud stopped growing. I removed the front panel using a screwdriver and inspection wrench. My hands were shaking inside the gloves, so the first screw slipped and rolled beneath a cabinet. I forced myself to slow down. The ventilation motor had stopped because the damper was stuck halfway closed. I reached inside the panel and pulled the manual release. The metal mechanism resisted. I pulled harder. Something snapped into place. The exhaust fan started immediately. A deep roar moved through the ventilation system. The dark cloud began lifting toward the ceiling. I pressed the alarm reset switch. The warning tone stopped. The sudden silence felt worse. For several minutes, I stood near the fume hood while the ventilation cleared the room. Shapes slowly appeared through the mist. At first, I saw overturned chairs and broken equipment. Then, I saw a hand on the floor. I moved closer. 4 people were lying in the laboratory. None of them moved. 1 was near the door. 2 were beside a workbench. The 4th was directly behind me. I recognized him as Devon. He was wearing a protective mask, but it had been torn from his face. 1 strap was still hanging around his neck. Deep scratches covered his cheeks and forehead. His eyes were closed. Blood had dried around his mouth. Devon? I knew he could not hear me, but I said his name anyway. I knelt and checked for movement. The contamination suit made it difficult to feel for a pulse. I saw no sign of breathing. The other 3 wore white laboratory coats. I did not recognize any of them. 1 man was lying face down. A woman had collapsed beside a broken chair. The 3rd person was partly hidden beneath a workbench. All appeared dead. I stepped away. I should have called for help immediately. Instead, I looked at the fume hood. A glass container remained inside it. Cloudy fluid moved slowly within the container, almost like smoke trapped in water. A warning label had been fixed to the side. Encephalomyelitis, a long row of numbers followed the word. I knew enough from working around the researchers to understand part of it. Encephalomyelitis involved inflammation of the brain and spinal cord. Several viruses could cause it. One of them was rabies. Rabies, I whispered. Movement reflected in the glass. I turned. One of the laboratory workers was running toward me. He had been lying motionless seconds earlier. Now he was moving faster than any injured person should have been able to move. His eyes were red. His mouth hung open. Saliva ran down his chin. He hit me before I could react. The force lifted me off my feet and slammed me onto the floor. My head struck the tiles. The helmet absorbed some of the impact, but my vision still flashed white. The man climbed on top of me. He clawed at my suit with both hands. There was no confusion in the attack. He wanted to kill me. His fingers pulled at the rubber around my shoulders and chest. When he could not tear through it, he lowered his head and bit the front of my helmet. His teeth scraped against the plastic face shield. He snapped at it repeatedly, trying to break through. Cracks spread across the outer surface. I grabbed his wrists and tried to push him away. His strength was unbelievable. He had the body of an average laboratory worker, but every muscle seemed locked at full force. Veins stood out across his neck and forehead. His eyes remained fixed on my face. There was nothing human in them. I pulled my knees toward my chest and planted both boots against his stomach. Then I kicked as hard as I could. He flew backward and struck a metal cabinet. The entire cabinet shook. Glass containers fell from the shelves and shattered around him. I rolled onto my side and pushed myself up. Another person attacked before I reached my feet. The woman who had been lying near the chair launched herself across the room. I ducked. She passed over me and crashed into the workbench. Glass beakers exploded beneath her hands. Sharp pieces cut her face and arms. She did not react. She pushed herself upright immediately. Behind her, Devon began to move, his head lifted from the floor. The fourth body crawled out from beneath the workbench. All four were alive, or at least they were moving. They turned toward me at the same time. I stepped backward. The fume hood was behind me. The main door was across the room, but two of them stood between me and the exit. To my right was the cold storage room. I ran toward it. The woman grabbed the back of my suit. I felt the material stretch around my shoulder. I twisted away, leaving part of the outer layer in her hand. The cold room door had a heavy metal handle. I pulled it. The seal released with a loud pop. Cold air rushed over me. I looked back. All four of them were standing together now. Their eyes were bright red. Saliva covered their mouths. Every muscle in their bodies appeared tense. Devon's fingers were bent like claws. The woman had a long piece of glass buried in her forearm. Blood ran from the wound, but she did not seem to notice. For 1 second, they remained completely still. Then they charged. I jumped into the cold room and pulled the door shut. Devon reached it first. His head struck the glass viewing window. Blood splattered across it. The impact would have knocked a normal person unconscious. He did not even fall. He hit the glass again. The others joined him. Hands slammed against the door. Fingernails scraped across the metal. Teeth snapped against the window. I locked the inside handle and backed away. That is where I am now. The cold storage room is meant to preserve biological samples. The temperature is far below freezing. My protective suit keeps some of the cold out, but it was damaged during the attack. The tear near my shoulder is getting larger every time I move. I can already feel the cold through my clothes. My fingers are becoming stiff. The four people outside have not stopped. Sometimes they pound on the door together. Sometimes they become quiet. During those moments, I can see them through the blood-covered window. They stand close to the glass and stare inside. They do not blink. A few minutes ago, Devon spoke. At least, I think it was him. His mouth moved strangely, as though he had forgotten how to form words. He said my name. Tyler. Then he smiled. I have tried calling the police several times. The first call connected for less than 3 seconds before the signal failed. I heard someone answer, but they could not hear me. Text messages remain unsent. The facility's internal emergency number does not respond. I also tried contacting the security guards. Nothing. There is another door at the rear of the cold room, but it leads into a specimen storage section. According to the building plans, there should be a service corridor beyond it. The problem is that the rear door has an electronic lock. The control panel is dead. I may be able to remove the panel and force the lock open, but my tools are outside the cold room. All I have with me is my phone, a utility knife, and a small metal temperature probe attached to my belt. The emergency release might be behind the panel. If I can pry it loose, I may have a way out. I need to move soon. The temperature display on the wall reads -12 degrees Celsius and continues dropping. My hands are shaking too much to type properly. The pounding has stopped again. I can see 3 people outside the window. Devon is missing. I do not know where he went. There should be no other way into this room. I just heard something move behind the specimen shelves. I thought it was the cooling system at first. Then I heard breathing. Slow, wet, close. I am going to try the rear door. If I survive, I will post again. If I do not, anyone who finds this needs to understand one thing. This was not an accident. Someone left that fume hood open. Someone disabled the ventilation, and whatever was inside that glass container was not ordinary rabies. I had no memory of taking the picture. That was the part I kept returning to. The camera had been buried under old gloves, charging cables, spare maps, and other things I had thrown into a storage box months earlier. I almost missed it when I was cleaning out the cab. It was one of those old instant print cameras from the early 2000s, the kind that pushed out a square photo a few seconds after you pressed the button. I had carried it for years, but rarely used it. There was a developed photograph sitting in the front pocket of the camera case. The moment I saw it, I knew where it had been taken. Inside my truck. That night, during the snowstorm. My name is Dev, and I have been driving long-haul routes through the Northern Rockies for 8 years. I know those roads better than most people know the streets around their own homes. I know the difference between black ice and a shadow across the road. I know how quickly mountain weather can change. I can look at the color of the sky and tell when snow is coming before the weather app gives its first warning. I have slept in my cab beside roads that are missing from modern maps, roads that most drivers would not touch after dark. I was never afraid of being alone. Dark roads, empty forests, and long nights had become normal to me. That changed somewhere between Billings and the Wyoming border. The storm came down hard and fast. By 9 o'clock that night, I could barely see beyond the front of my own truck. Snow moved across the road in thick sheets, rushing through the headlights so quickly that it felt like I was driving through a tunnel of white noise. The wind pushed against the trailer. The steering wheel kept pulling slightly to the left. Every few seconds, the tires slipped beneath me before finding the road again. I had already reduced my speed twice, but it was not enough. Company policy allowed us to stop for up to 2 hours if weather conditions became unsafe. The conditions had been unsafe for at least 40 minutes, and I knew that continuing would be stupid. A clean wrong decision is better than a lucky bad one. Most drivers only learn that after wrecking something expensive. I looked for a safe place to pull over. There were no rest stops nearby, and no businesses marked on the route. The road passed through miles of forest, broken only by old access roads and logging tracks. I spotted one of those roads on my left. It used to be maintained by the Forest Service, but judging by its condition, no one had used it regularly in years. The entrance was half covered by snow, and the wooden sign beside it had faded until the lettering was almost impossible to read. It was the kind of road that appeared on older paper maps, but not on GPs. I turned onto it slowly. The truck pushed through several inches of fresh snow before I found a wide enough section to park without blocking the road completely. Tall pine trees surrounded me on both sides, their branches bending under the weight of the storm. There were no lights in any direction, no houses, no other vehicles, no sign that anyone had been there recently. I set the brakes and left the engine running for a few minutes while I checked the weather report. The storm was supposed to weaken before midnight. I decided to rest for an hour, maybe 90 minutes, and then continue once visibility improved. I shut down the engine. The silence came immediately. When you drive a truck for hours, the constant vibration becomes part of your body. You stop noticing the sound of the engine. You stop noticing the road beneath the tires. When the engine turns off, the sudden stillness can feel unnatural. I locked both doors and checked them twice. Then I pulled the thermal curtains across the side windows and windshield. They were thick, insulated curtains designed to keep light and cold out of the sleeping area. Once they were closed, the cab became completely dark. Dark inside, dark outside. I climbed onto the sleeper bunk and stretched out with my phone. I planned to answer a few messages, check the route again, and wait for the worst of the storm to pass. I was awake for about 10 minutes before I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was snow falling from the branches. Then I heard it again. Crunch, a pause. Crunch, the sound was slow and heavy. Someone or something was walking through the snow. I turned the volume down on my phone and listened. The footsteps continued. They were not random. They were not the light, uneven movements of a deer. They did not sound like an animal searching for food. They were evenly spaced. Deliberate, unhurried, whoever was walking out there was coming directly toward my truck from somewhere deep in the trees. I told myself it could still be an animal. A large deer. An elk. Maybe a branch had broken and fallen in a way that only sounded like footsteps. But I had spent enough nights in forests to know what I was hearing. Something with weight was walking on two legs. It kept coming. Crunch, pause, crunch, the sound grew louder until it reached the side of the cab. Then it stopped, right outside the driver's door. I lay still on the bunk. I did not move. I did not reach for my phone. I barely breathed. There were only a few feet between me and whatever stood outside. The metal door, the glass, and the curtain were the only things separating us. Nothing happened. No knock. No voice. No sound of someone walking away. Whoever had approached my truck had simply stopped beside it and remained there. That was worse than if they had knocked. A stranded driver might have called out. A police officer or Forest Service worker would have identified themselves. A person looking for help would have tried to get my attention. This thing did nothing. It stood beside a dark truck in the middle of a snowstorm, miles from the nearest town, and waited. Minutes passed. The wind rose and fell around the cab. Snow tapped against the glass. The metal frame creaked as it cooled. Underneath those sounds, I could feel the presence outside. I know how ridiculous that sounds. You cannot hear someone standing still. You cannot prove that a person is there if they are not making a sound. But I knew. Something was beside the door. It was not moving. It was not leaving. And it was completely calm. That calmness frightened me more than anything else. 15 minutes passed before the door handle moved. It did not rattle. It did not shake. The handle lowered slowly. Careful pressure, then release. A pause. 30 seconds later, it happened again. Slow pressure, then release. Whatever was outside was checking whether the door was locked. I stared into the darkness. I had locked both doors. I remembered doing it. I had checked them twice. Still, I imagined the lock failing. I imagined the door opening 1 inch at a time. The handle moved a third time, then stopped. I waited for footsteps moving away. Nothing, the silence returned, but the thing had not gone. I could still feel it outside. Then the radio turned on. Static filled the cab. It was not tuned to a station, just the low, dry hiss of and white noise. I stared toward the front of the truck. The radio had been off. No timer had been set. There was no one near the controls. I was lying 6 feet away on the sleeper bunk. The static continued. At first, it was the only sound. Then, the scratching began. It started near the rear corner of the cab. A thin, dragging scrape moved across the metal. Fingernails, or something that behaved like fingernails. It moved slowly along the outside of the truck, traveling toward the door. Scratch, pause, scratch. It sounded almost gentle, as though someone was tracing the shape of the cab with one finger. The sound reached the driver's door, then moved upward around the frame of the window. I remained completely still. A child laughed. The sound was high, clear, and close. It was not a scream. It was not distorted. It was the normal laugh of a young child, the kind of sound you might hear in a garden on a warm afternoon. It lasted around 3 seconds. Then it stopped. Every muscle in my body tightened. I did not know whether the child was outside or whether the sound had come through the radio. Before I could decide, a voice spoke from the other side of the window. Soft, close, we can see the curtain moving. The voice sounded young, not quite the same as the child who had laughed. I stopped breathing. The curtain had not moved. At least I did not think it had. I was lying still, but the air from the heater might have shifted the fabric slightly. My breathing might have made it move, or maybe they could not see it at all. Maybe they were trying to make me reveal myself. I closed my eyes and remained still. I do not know how long I stayed like that. My legs went numb. My back began to ache. The cold slowly entered the cab now that the engine was off. The radio static continued for a while and then stopped without warning. The scratching had stopped too. I listened carefully. At first, there was nothing. Then I heard the footsteps again. They moved away from the driver's door. Crunch, pause, crunch. They circled toward the front of the truck. I felt a small amount of relief. They were moving away. That gave me a chance. I forced myself to think. Snow had already begun building up around the rear tires. If I waited much longer, the truck might become stuck until morning. I also had a delivery window to meet, though that felt less important now. I needed to start the engine and get back onto the main road. I had a walkie-talkie near the driver's seat, but there was no guarantee anyone would hear me. I had no mobile signal. The only real option was to drive. I waited until the footsteps reached the front of the truck. Then I moved. I slid from the bunk to the driver's seat without turning on any lights. I kept one hand on the curtain and the other near the ignition. My plan was simple. Pull the curtain, start the engine, reverse immediately. Do not look outside. I pulled the curtain back in one movement and turned the key. The engine came alive. The headlights switched on automatically. There were 3 people standing in the road. A man, a woman, a child. They were around 30 feet in front of the truck with their backs toward me. They stood close together. Too close. Their shoulders almost touched. None of them wore a hat. None of them wore a coat. The temperature outside was 11 below zero. They should have been shaking. They should have been covered in snow. Instead, they stood perfectly still. Something about the way they held themselves made my instincts take over. I pressed the accelerator before I could get a better look. The tires spun. The truck moved forward a few feet, then slid sideways. I turned the wheel, trying to correct it, but the rear tires lost their grip. The rig dropped into a shallow ditch at the edge of the road. The cab tilted. I hit the brakes. For 1 second, I was too shocked to move. Then I looked up. All 3 figures had turned around. The headlights caught them fully. The man and woman wore clothes that looked old. Not old in the sense of worn out. Old-fashioned. The man wore thick trousers and a heavy wool shirt with suspenders. The woman wore a long dress under a dark shawl. The cuts and materials looked like clothing from an old family photograph, something from the late 19th century or early 20th. Their skin was pale. Not the pale color of people who had been standing in freezing weather. It had no warmth in it at all. Their eyes were open. Neither of them blinked. There was no anger on their faces. No fear. No curiosity. Nothing. Only attention. They looked at my truck the way someone might look at a door they had been waiting years to see open. The child stood between them. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He was staring directly at me. He raised one hand. Then he waved. Slowly, patiently. It was not a threatening gesture. It was not an invitation. It looked like goodbye, the way a child waves to someone they know. I pressed the accelerator again. The tires spun uselessly. The engine roared while the rear axle slipped deeper into the snow. I shifted gears, turned the wheel, and tried again. The truck moved a few inches, then stopped. The family did not approach. They stayed where they were. Watching, the child's hand remained raised. I worked the accelerator for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 4 minutes. Sweat ran down my face despite the cold. Finally, the rear tires caught the edge of the road. The truck lurched violently. I corrected the wheel and pulled out of the ditch. I did not look at the three figures again. I stared at the road in front of me and drove. The storm had not weakened, but I no longer cared about visibility. I drove faster than I should have. Branches moved in the headlights. Snow struck the windshield. The trailer slid once on the access road, but I kept going until I reached Route 212. I turned onto the highway and did not slow down until the tree line began to break. A gas station appeared through the snow. Its fluorescent lights made it look unreal. I pulled into the lot and parked beside the repair shop. The rear bumper had bent when the truck entered the ditch, and one of the side panels was damaged. The mechanic who came outside was a large, quiet man named Glenn. His adult son worked with him. Glenn looked at the truck and then looked at me. He did not ask what had happened. He asked where I had come from. I told him about the old Forest Service road off Route 212. He stopped moving. His son looked at him. They shared a glance. It was not the look people give when they think someone is lying. It was the look of two people who had heard the same story before. Glenn opened the shop and told me to come inside. He poured coffee into a paper cup and set it in front of me without asking whether I wanted any. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had to hold the cup with both of them. "There's a house back there," Glenn said. He spoke while wiping down the counter as though the conversation did not deserve his full attention. "About a mile into the woods." "What kind of house?" "Old farmhouse." "Does anyone live there?" He shook his head. "Not for a long time." I waited for more. He continued cleaning the counter. "People come through here sometimes," he said. "Talk about seeing things on that road." "What things?" He looked at me then. His expression made it clear that he did not want to answer. "We don't go up there," he said. That was all. I did not push him. Glenn and his son worked on the truck for more than an hour. They straightened the bumper enough for me to continue and checked the tires for damage. When the repair was finished, I paid in cash. Glenn stood beside the cab while I prepared to leave. "You should stay here until morning," he said. "I need to keep moving." He looked toward the road. Then, "Don't stop again." I turned the heater as high as it would go and drove the rest of the night without taking another break. For the first week, I tried to convince myself that exhaustion had affected me. I had been driving for hours. The storm had reduced visibility. The figures might have been stranded travelers. Their clothing might have looked strange because of the light and snow. The voice outside the window might have been the radio. The child's laugh might have been interference. There were explanations for almost everything. Not good explanations, but explanations. 3 weeks later, I was cleaning out a box of old equipment at home. That was when I found the camera. I had carried it in my bag on the night of the storm, but I had forgotten about it. The camera case had a narrow pocket on the front. A photograph was inside. I pulled it out and immediately recognized the scene. It showed the inside of my truck. The angle was from the sleeper bunk. The dashboard was visible. The curtains were closed across the windshield and side windows. The cab looked exactly as it had while I was lying in the dark, listening to the footsteps outside. I had no memory of taking the picture. That alone would have been frightening. But there was something else. A child was sitting in the driver's seat. The same boy from the road. He was turned toward the camera. His skin was pale. His eyes were wide open, and he was waving. I dropped the photograph. For several minutes, I could not make myself touch it again. When I finally picked it up, I examined every part of the image. The driver's door was locked. The curtains were closed. There was no snow inside. The boy's clothes were dry. He looked completely solid. Not blurred, not transparent, not like a reflection. He was there, inside the cab, while I had been lying on the bunk. I showed the picture to no one. I thought about taking it to Glenn, but I never did. Part of me was afraid he would recognize the child. Another part was afraid he would tell me something worse. I placed the photograph back in the camera case and locked it inside a metal box. A few months later, I checked it again. The child was still there. But his hand had moved. In the first photograph, he had been waving with his fingers spread. Now, only one finger was raised, pointing upward, toward the top of the cab. I threw the camera away. I burned the photograph. At least, I tried to. The edges blackened, but the center would not catch. The image of the child remained untouched while the paper around him curled into ash. I eventually buried it beneath a pile of rocks outside town. I still drive through the Rockies. It is my job, and I am good at it. I still pull over when the weather becomes dangerous. I still sleep in the cab. But I do not use that access road anymore. I do not use any road that is missing from the GPS. I check both locks 3 times before closing the curtains. I never leave old cameras in the truck, and I always keep the radio off. Sometimes, during heavy snow, it turns on anyway, only for a few seconds, only static. Then, beneath the hiss, I hear a child laughing, and a soft voice says the same thing every time. We can see the curtain moving. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.